Unreal Engine 5's early access has been released, and I've spent the last few days looking into the released Valley of the Ancients demo. So in today's video, I will go into the technical characteristics of this demo across a variety of GPU and CPU hardware so that we can get a sense of how UE5 is targeting its visuals and perhaps performance, at least in this early state. And to talk about this today, I'm joined, of course, by my friend and colleague, John Linneman. How you doing there, John?
I'm doing wonderful, Alex. Like you, I've been toying around with Unreal Engine 5, though perhaps not to the same degree, owing to other projects, but it's an impressive showpiece. So quickly, I'll touch on what this demo is, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about it. So when loaded into the demo, you can sort of explore this world. It starts out as a drone. You can fly around in the drone, you can get up close to objects, sort of examine your surroundings, or you can essentially transport to the dark world or whatever and run around as this character here. It kind of gives you an idea of both free camera control and character action. It's designed to showcase what Nanite and Lumen can offer for a very large-scale environment with a ton of granular detail. And it also makes use of Unreal's new and improved temporal super resolution feature, which is their reconstruction technology. Actually, you know what? Maybe we should start with that before we get into some of the nitty-gritty details. What are your thoughts on this?
This one's really cool because we've usually seen in games reconstruction up to 4K happening at around like checkerboard middle resolution, like 1440p-ish or higher, and then it usually works really well there. But this TSR, since it's more advanced, at least that's the development behind it, it's trying to get even lower resolutions to look more like 4K. So if you look at these side-by-sides here of TSR running internally at 1080p versus the real native 4K presentation, you can see how in these still shots here, they're actually incredibly similar to one another. And that's kind of the goal behind TSR here, because the engine currently in its current form is targeting at these epic settings for this demo specifically around 1080p and 30 FPS on the console hardware, something like PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. So it's about getting these lower internal resolutions looking much higher. And it does a really, really great job of that in this demo. In terms of first impressions, the only part where it starts to break apart is what you'd see with like normal TAA. Usually where like the camera moves or an object moves, or there's like transparency effects, and that's when you can start seeing more of the ghosting or more of a breakdown in that resolution. But generally TSR is definitely doing a really, really good job. I'd like to compare it to DLSS in the future if I have the chance, and more in depth.
Yeah, thinking about that, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that TSR is designed for consoles. From a normal viewing distance in a living room, I think these artifacts become less obvious. On a PC monitor, it can be slightly more visible, which is where perhaps DLSS comes into play if you're running an NVIDIA card, of course. But I guess one of the points people might note, though, is that the demo they showcased, and I believe they showcased the game demo on both PS5 and Xbox Series X in their original video stream, the resolution is lower due to the increased cost of Nanite in this demo. But obviously, there is a lot more to this demo than just that. Perhaps we should actually break this down into chunks, starting, I think, with Nanite and everything kind of around that.
Basically, when I came into this demo, I wanted to look at particular parts in isolation, but not go so in depth because I want to wait more till there's actually production games coming out of this, because I don't want to give off false impressions of a work in progress piece of engine, as well as something that's designed around a technical demo and not around a production game, which will have different constraints.
This is pure curiosity, I think, on our part.
Nanite, when I initially looked into it, it does exactly like they described it does. You get camera really in close to an object, and you can see that the detail is maintained up to a really fine resolution in terms of geometry. It goes right in there, and you can see it all really, really well. And, the only difference that you can possibly see in this demo when I show like a really close-up shot is you may see that different objects, due to the way they made this demo, you can see like different levels, I would say, of geometric or texture detail. Like it's almost like they're running at different resolutions. And that's just because for this demo, they threw a bunch of different large mega assets, as they call them, together to build the terrain itself. And depending upon the size of the imported asset in terms of its texture or in terms of how many actual triangles are made up of it, you can see like differing levels of detail just right next to each other. And that's something that I think is only going to happen in a demo like this one. I think in a production game, they would maybe be more aware of, I would say, like which triangle counts are being put next to which triangle counts. So right now, I think nanite looks really great when you zoom in, but in this demo, at least specifically, if you zoom in on certain objects, you'll be like, oh, that doesn't look as good as this other object.
It is interesting, though, because it feels like we've finally reached the point where the visuals are constrained more by the original asset rather than like how it's used within the game engine.
It's pretty interesting. I think a really cool part of this demo as well too is you can have really high resolution assets in games, and I think we already see that a lot now, but sometimes I've showed it before in videos showcasing ray trace shadows. Like I showed it off really well, I think, in Call of Duty Black Ops, the new one, where you can see in some scenes where if you turn on ray trace shadows, you can see all of a sudden this geometric detail shows through a lot better because objects and all their little fine details now have little shadows on them. That's something that this demo really shows off well with the virtual shadow map system, which does not use traditional ray tracing like we're used to, but is a very specialized form of shadow mapping. And when you get really close to objects, you can also see like really, pixel fine shadows on them, maybe with a bit of aliasing at times, depending on the camera angle and all these other probably factors as well, but it makes the geometry show up much better than if it were not there at all. And that's another really cool part of the demo.
Kind of reminds me of when we first saw screen space shadows. In fact, it's a similar type of idea, but without the screen space artifacts, of course. So it does look very consistent and sort of builds this beautiful environment and ties everything together in a way.
My favorite part about the demo actually, I described this to you before we started talking about this on video right now, but I like the level of detail that you get from these little shadows and
Yes.
also from the little geometric detail, but it's actually when you move the camera back and forth through the terrain or zoom in on an object, you don't see the usual like pop of a new level of detail being loaded in, or for the shadows, you don't see the kind of cascade distance where shadows pop in, or you can see the lower resolution cascade kind of go to the higher resolution one in a line. None of that happens in this demo. I think that's the most impressive part, and it impresses me more than nanite itself. It's just like how you can go backwards and forwards, and you don't see any of this usual video game popping effect. That's the thing that impressed me the most.
That's kind of the triple whammy issue in a lot of modern games, where you have both the visible shadow cascade layers changing, you have the LOD pop in, and then on top of that, especially in consoles, texture filtering is often not cranked up. So as you look across the distance and you're moving forward through the world, you see all of these things changing before your eyes. Whereas here, like you say, it's absolutely striking to fly the camera through the world, and it just has this consistency and solidity to it that I feel like we've not really seen before with this kind of high density environments.
Like I said, continuous level of detail, as I'll call it, is the most impressive part of the demo for me. As I say that though, for some reason, and I'm not sure what is exactly causing this, I'm not sure if this is a bug or if this is something just the way nanite works, but sometimes if you pay attention and look at the distance at an object and you move the camera forward, you can almost see like a warbling effect that occurs. And it made me think like, oh, there's like some sort of post-process going on here that is supposed to look like desert kind of heat haze or something like that. So, but then I notice also when I move the camera here, like you're seeing in this video right here, I move it side to side very slowly, and then I stop the camera, and you can almost see like the ground doing a shuffle effect. Like there's almost like the ground is made up of layers that go into the distance and then shuffle into proper 3D perspective after a little bit. I don't know how to describe it very well. I hope people in the video are maybe seeing it so it doesn't sound like I'm going crazy here. But I saw this in the demo, and it may be a bug, it may be a feature, I have no idea, but it's definitely something that's here.
I noticed it as well, and I would say it's much more subtle than this, but I was kind of reminded of how when you examine textures with parallax occlusion maps enabled and they kind of start to break down, obviously not to that degree, but it's that same sort of impression where you can see something's a little bit off there. But by and large, though, I think nanite is very, very impressive in this, and it's going to be fantastic both for regular games, but also I was thinking about its use case in like stuff like VR. When the camera's very close, you're in close proximity to things. It might provide a level of detail that we've never seen before. But of course, the other major feature I think to discuss here is Lumen.
Right now, because I know Lumen is slightly work in progress in terms of its feature set and possibly as well regarding its performance in a number of ways, I didn't want to go super in depth here, but just going through the demo, there's some really obvious parts where you can see Lumen in action. Lumen's global illumination, so bounce lighting. And like here underneath this kind of craggy rock face, as you see the sunlight hitting the ground below it, you can see orange glow emanating from the ground and hitting this craggy rock face above. And that's exactly what you really want to see. Other than for larger features, if you do look up closely, you see this rock on the ground here as I move the camera up and down. You can see some aspects of that bounce lighting for smaller objects is done in screen space, but for most of the camera angles here that the demo takes place in, and there's not a lot of, like, I would call it occlusion. There's not a lot of fine indirect shadows here, essentially, in a lot of these scenes, which would make maybe some of these screen space aspects a little bit more obvious. But in the demo itself, it definitely does a really great job. But as we'll get to a bit later, I think it is very expensive. Here we can go over to performance, I think. First, starting with the CPUs. To test CPU performance here, I set the game to 30% axis resolution with TSR on, so it's like 648p. It's like really low resolution internally.
Those shots were interesting, by the way. It actually it does an effective job of upscaling the image from such a low resolution.
Like, this doesn't look like 648p, people.
No, it does not.
No, it doesn't. Here I found out, at least on the NVIDIA driver side, that Unreal Engine 5 does still seem to prefer faster single cores versus many slightly slower cores. So the Core i9-10900K ended up being around 10% faster than the Ryzen 9 5950X, even though, of course, that Ryzen 5950X has way more cores, way more threads, and a lot more cache and all these things. Mid-range performance-wise, though, the 3600, Ryzen 5 3600, which I expect to be, a little bit more powerful than a console CPU in some aspects, is not hitting 60 FPS. It's like right on the line. And definitely if you were to move the camera around or engage in aspects of this demo, it would be below 60 FPS. And I think this shows off just really well that this demo was designed around 30 FPS CPU wise, also in terms of some of the aspects of the visuals, which we'll get to later. But I think it's a demo very much so designed around 30 FPS, and trying to get it up to 60 is perhaps harder than it would be in other production level games.
And again, you've stressed this and said it right there. This is not like a shipping game product.
One thing I noticed also here too is kind of going in with that trend that we've seen from other games recently, is that the AMD driver, when it's CPU limited on the 10900K, ran around 5% faster in this limited scenario here. Not huge numbers, but definitely something that was measurable. Let's get into GPU performance then.
Yeah, so first of all, it should be noted that, again, console versions that were shown were targeting 1080p using the TSR with epic settings up to 4K resolution, essentially. They target 30 frames per second here. So it seems like a low target, but the end result is good. But you did note some significant differences there and found a lot of interesting data on the PC.
Yeah, for sure. On the PC side here, we know from what Epic has kind of stated through public channels that the PC version has some slight less optimizations than the console versions of UE5 at the moment. Like, it's not using some async stuff to make the GPU perform a little bit better, as well as it's not using the quote-unquote mesh shader path for those hardware rendered triangles on PC. So it could technically run nanite and stuff a little bit quicker with more optimization. But this is what I found so far. And I put essentially the high end and the mid end right next to each other, starting with the Founders Edition RTX 3080 on the one side here and the XFX Merc Speedster 319.
Hold on. The XFX Merc Speedster?
Or something like that, yeah.
What? Man, dude. You know what? I love it. I miss this. I hope the box has some kind of crazy, like, CGI rendered Merc on there.
Sadly, the box is a little bit more boring, but the card is really fast. It has like a 6% OC essentially, so take that in account when I show these Dex performance things.
With a name like that, this thing better decimate everyone. So how does it actually perform?
Well, in the initial part of the Valley benchmark area here, I noticed that the cards were performing extremely similar to one another, just slightly below 60 FPS at this 1080p internal Epic settings. You get further into the demo though, and the AMD GPU actually starts asserting its dominance. It runs in this overlook section here 12% better, which I actually think is pretty impressive, just like overlooking this area.
So you could say it kind of murked that.
Yes.
Other card.
It murked the other card here, right here. It has overclock and all that, so keep that in mind. The RX 6800 XT, this Merc edition here, maintains a lead throughout the rest of the demo, fluctuating between 5 or 12% faster, depending upon what's happening. A little bit less in the cutscenes and more having a larger advantage in the gameplay. But if you notice when watching this, both GPUs are dipping handsomely, as I'll describe it, below 60 FPS when particles detonate near the forward center of the screen, which I think really just shows off how this demo is not designed as a shipping product, where you would not want such large deviations probably in performance due to effects going on screen. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But both, big GPUs here are not hitting a fully stable 60 FPS at this internal 1080p resolution in this demo.
That's kind of what I was going to get to. Yes, exactly. So that's interesting. But then I guess my bigger question then is, how does it run on a less powerful card? Let's say you do not have an XFX Merc Speedster, whatever, but you have something a little less potent. What did you find?
I ran it also on my mid-range twins, as I'm going to call them, RTX 2060 Super stock and an RX 5700 reference card. And here I found a slight reverse situation at this mid-range part where the Valley scene runs 10% better on the RTX 2060 Super. But when you get over the Dark World, you don't see an AMD advantage like we saw earlier, but more the cards being equaled out with some scenes as part of this golem fight running in the range of around 10% faster on the RTX 2060 Super. So it evens out more towards the second half of the demo in the Dark World, but the RTX 2060 Super ends up being faster. But once again, important to note at this 1080p internal resolution, my goodness, this demo is so heavy.
All right, so what's sort of the minimum card you need to get a locked 30 FPS then?
Here, I think it's going to be around an RTX 2070 Super, where the majority of all of this demo ran above 30 FPS, with only one small drop below when the golem falls and the screen fills up with dust, which is where I think, this demo is not optimized around that at all. It's just, a demo. So something like an RTX 2070 Super, and on the AMD side, an RX 5700 XT should probably do the job really, really well.
Man, these epic settings here, even at 1080p, it is really surprising how demanding this is right now.
It's incredibly demanding. With TSR enabled, it is 1080p internally, and it looks a lot better than 1080p, of course. So that's always something you have to keep in mind. I'm saying 1080p, but that's just, the end visual result is much better than that. But still, we're looking at something that is really, really heavy.
Right, sure.
That's why there's an emphasis on scalability. Epic notes this in their wiki entry on Lumen, that they recommend not using these epic settings for games targeting higher frame rates, but the high settings, which I'm going to show off right here, both in side-by-sides and back and forth, so people in the audience get a greater understanding of what's happening. I'm not going to talk about the differences in depth of field actually that happen here, but that's one thing that happens between the high and the epic settings. Ignoring the depth of field in the moment and equalizing that, if you look at what's happening with the lighting in the scene when you go down from epic to high, is you'll see what looks like the screen space GI portion of Lumen looks to be culled or removed or heavily reduced to the point where you're missing some of these smaller shadows and smaller bounce lights, like underneath the character models and things like that. So there is a definite downgrade in the visual quality, but if you imagine how most of this demo is taking place at eye level, going down to high actually probably, at least for these outdoor scenes, is not going to be a really large difference. As I say that though, at this 1080p internal resolution, I did run it on RTX 2070 Super to see what the difference would be in performance. It does not bring up the scene from 30 FPS to 60 FPS, but increases performance, at least on this GPU here in this scene, by around 10%. So I imagine when they say in this Wikipedia entry of 60 FPS targeting games should be looking to use the high setting, I imagine that they're actually talking about not about this demo necessarily, but about other products that use Lumen in the future.
Yes.
So, this demo was not designed around trying to reach 60, but something could, on this high setting, be more easily designed to reach 60. That's the way I interpret it.
Kind of feels like the big takeaway here right now. The demo is very heavy, but very promising. Seeing Unreal Engine 5 in action and playing around with its features, it's clearly a very powerful tool. Nanite is very, very neat to see. It's going to change the way we kind of look at world geometry going forward. And Lumen, while very expensive, is also very promising. And in fact, just using the editor, I really like how you can essentially drop a light in the scene and just start moving it around and immediately see results in the editor without needing to rely on bakes and waiting on this stuff. It's just there. And I'll be curious to talk to more artists and hear what they think about working with tools like this. I mean, ray tracing in general has already brought a lot of this stuff forward, and this is like another step for Unreal Engine. I think it's just going to really help a lot with like building these worlds to make them beautiful.
That's exactly how I feel too. Yeah. Getting towards the end of this demo and kind of my concluding thoughts based upon what I've seen in performance and visuals, I want to say that like I really think Lumen looks really great in person. I do just wonder what scalability settings they'll add into the future to it, and how it'll evolve over time to maybe, right now it's a software solution, but maybe the hardware path that they end up making will end up being the way they take it in the future. Who really knows? In terms of the demo being really heavy, it was obviously really heavy on the GPU and aspects of the CPU, but there were also some aspects of the demo which were not very heavy that I didn't really describe when I'm just talking about the GPU performance. The game currently, when you export this demo here, due to the way it uses virtualized textures and virtualized geometry through Nanite, actually it doesn't use that much VRAM. It's using a little bit more than 4 gigabytes of VRAM.
Wow.
Like max, even on something like an RTX 3090 while having this quality. So it's really, really VRAM efficient technology that we're looking at here, which is great for, I would say lower end devices or, the mid-range GPUs that you see now. And also, I would say the loading was really, really fast. The first time you play the demo, and you may see videos of this out there online, the first time you play it, since it's not a production shipping game, it's not going to pre-cache shaders or pre-cache anything before the game loads. So it'll run slower and it'll have hitches. So if you see videos out there online where people are saying, I can't believe how poor UE5 is running. Well, they're not showing actually how UE5 runs. If you run the game more than once, it runs actually completely fine because it caches shaders, caches data, and things like that. Something a normal game would do on loads.
Yep, absolutely.
When you do that, though, you can see that the game loads just like they showed in the editor in their little preview video that they did, in like around 4 to 5 seconds when you go from the Lumen world, like this overworld valley, into the dark world. And that's really, really fast given the large differences in detail that we're seeing here on screen, different textures, different assets, as well as the fact that we're looking at PCs here that are not using direct storage. Something like a PlayStation 5 would load this really, really, really quickly. Coming to the end of this year, really impressed. Really heavy, but also so much promise. And John, thank you so much for talking to me about this demo here.
Absolutely.
And if you did like this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support Digital Foundry on Patreon to get years worth of our content in high quality for download. If you want to talk to John or myself about this demo, well, write a comment below or follow both of us on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex bidding you auf Wiedersehen und
Nanite's really good.